Hello, today we're going to go over the first chapter, the Exploring the World of Business and Economics. We have several learning objectives at the front of each chapter. This particular chapter has 7 learning objectives. The first thing you're going to learn from this chapter, discuss what you must do to be successful in the world of business. Secondly, define business and identify potential risk and rewards. Then, define economics and describe 2 types of economic systems, capitalism and command economy. Learning objective 4 is identify the ways to measure economic performance. Number 5, examine the different phases in the typical business cycle. Number 6, outline the 4 types of competition. And finally, number 7, summarize the factors that affect the business environment and the challenges that American businesses will encounter in the future. Individuals are free to decide what to produce, how to produce it, and what price to sell it. So you'll need to remember this is what we call 3 enterprises. Know that the exams will have several questions that will be definitions. The definitions are found in your book on the right and left margins of each page. What about your future in the changing business world? If you haven't decided, you need to decide what do you want, why do you want it, and write it down. This is a guy named Joe Dudley, a very successful businessman, who says success is a journey, not just a destination. Why would you study business? You may or may not be a business major. It matters. This is going to help you choose your career. It will help you learn how to be a successful employee in any type business. It will help you improve your management skills. Should you try to start your own business someday, it will help you do that. And finally, it will help you become a better informed consumer and investor. There's several things in the chapter we'll talk about with regard to the consumer and investor information. Some tips for studying this chapter, this book. Be sure that you prepare before you go to class. In the case of online, be sure that you're prepared according to the schedule on coursework. Obviously, that means you need to read the chapter. You need to keep a notebook, a journal. You may want to underline or highlight important concepts in the chapter. Of course, take some notes. You need to know how to apply the concepts in the chapters. Something you're going to hear very often in this course is to practice critical thinking. You'll be doing that in essays. You'll be doing that with the ethics game and several other areas of this course. Obviously, prepare for the examinations. I'll be providing a review prior to each exam. I call that review a focused review. What I'll actually do is create the exam. Then I will look at which learning objectives in each chapter are covered on that particular exam, and how many questions from each learning objective of the chapter. I'll be furnishing you a document, one sheet, and it will have this list. For instance, exam 1 will have the learning objectives covered on the exam in chapter 1, 3, and 4. Below that, it will list for each chapter not only which learning objective is covered, but how many questions on that learning objectives. What this will do, this will cut your study time for the exams in about half. What is a business? Here's a good definition right out of the book. The organized effort of individuals to produce and sell for a profit the goods and services that satisfy society's needs. Now, in order to do this, all businesses must have these 4 resources on the slide, and you've got to use them effectively to be successful. The first, in my opinion, the most important one, human resources, people. Material resources, whatever your company needs. Informational resources, that can include information within the company, sales data sheets, articles that you read on your business, what's going on in the economy. Lots of things are informational. And finally, financial resources. Money and cash flow is the lifeblood of all businesses. You've got to have a plan, and you've got to have adequate financial resources to keep the business moving. There's different kinds of businesses: service businesses, manufacturing businesses. Then there are what we call marketing intermediaries. Service businesses are someone that produce a service such as getting a haircut, going to a lawyer, going to your CPA for tax work. They give an example here, H&R Block. Also restaurants. Manufacturing, of course, is talking about companies that have the ability to take certain materials and processes and turn them into tangible goods. Example, Intel. Example, Dell Computers. Something you may not be familiar with is marketing intermediaries. These people buy products from the manufacturer and then resell them. For example, Sony Corporation. A lot of time these companies have sales force. Sometimes manufacturers use intermediaries that are people that buy their product and sell it to the end users. The importance of manufacturing is talked about by a gentleman named Alexander Hamilton when he was reporting to Congress back in 1791. Again, he says not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufacturers. Every nation, with a view to those great objects, ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. These comprise the means of subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense. It's been a couple of 100 years or so, and I don't believe anything has changed with regard to this. What is an e-business? I expect you're already familiar with e-business. Most of you probably already use the internet to purchase many of the things you buy nowadays. But its definition in the book says it's the organized effort of individuals to produce and sell for a profit the goods and services that satisfy society's needs through the facilities available on the internet, different than going to the mall or strip center. Again, e-business is growing extremely fast, and in fact, malls and those sorts of delivery systems are waning at this time. They're actually bulldozing malls. But e-business has become a way to increase sales and profits for most businesses nowadays. Now we have to talk about profit. Again, profit is what a company goes for. You don't have profit, you're out of business very soon. But very simply said, you have sales revenue of some type. You have sales expenses, company expenses of all kinds. When you subtract those expenses from the revenue, it's called profit. Obviously, if you don't make a profit, you have a loss. That's when your expenses are higher than your revenue. If you have a loss over an extended period of time, again, the business will fail. So part of your financial planning should include adequate capital to get you through the first, say, year, to be sure if you're going to have some time frames where you're not making a profit, that you can get to the point you can make a profit. Again, what is it? Profit's the reward for producing goods and services that people want. The reward comes because there's risk involved by every company. There's a risk that you may not receive payment for whatever it is you're selling or offering. There's also a risk of losing your entire investment. So you must have profit. An important term is what we call stakeholders. Again, definition right out of the book. They are all the different people or groups of people who are affected by the policies and decisions made by an organization. For instance, stakeholders obviously are consumers, the marketing intermediaries that I talked about earlier. And yes, if it's a company that has stockholders, they're stakeholders. The most important maybe stockholder of all, again, is your employees. What this means is who could be affected by the decisions you make, again. If you continue in the business, you're successful, all your stakeholders are taken care of. If you do not do well, look at all the stakeholders that could be harmed. One that's not listed is the local tax entities. that fund your schools, your cities, repair your streets, and what have you. They're actually stakeholders as well. Another good definition, economics. There's two types of economics we're going to talk about. But economics is the study of how wealth is created and distributed. Just remember this, the word micro means small. Microeconomics is the study of decisions made by individuals and businesses. The second level of economics to study is macro with an A. That's the study of the national and global economies. Now we're talking about manufacturing. Earlier, there's what they call the factors of production. These are the resources used to produce goods and services. For instance, land and natural resources may be used like a farmer. Labor, time and effort to produce the goods and services. If it's a farm, it would be the person driving the farm tractor, the person driving the combine, the person gathering up the hay in the field. Capital, again, has to do with finance. This is the money, facilities, equipment, machines, everything used by the organization. Finally, entrepreneurship, activity that organizes land and natural resources, labor, and capital. This is what the business owner or manager does. From an entrepreneurship standpoint, you are a manager. Definition again of an entrepreneur is a person who risks his or her time, effort, and money to start and operate a business. The person may own the business, he may or may not have partners, he or she. A nation's economy. Again, the definition of an economy is the system through which a society creates and distributes wealth. What goods and services and how much of each will be produced? How will these goods and services be produced? For whom will these goods and services be produced? And finally, who owns and controls the major factors of production? This is going to be very important to note that in different types of economies, for instance, command economies, these four things are differently looked at in these kind of countries where sometimes the country owns all of the factors of production. Capitalism, again, is a good definition in the book. Economic system in which individuals own and operate the majority of businesses that provide goods and services. If I had to ask you a question right now, ask you what type of an economy we have in the United States, my guess is you would answer a capitalistic economy, or that we employ capitalism. And that is true to a degree. We'll talk more about that. There's this guy, Adam Smith, again in the 1700s, looked at how things were going in the United States. He was looking from Europe. So he says laissez-faire capitalism, which means in French, hands off, is the way to go. Because over here we had the right to limited government intervention, the right to economic freedom, freedom to compete, the right to own private property and resources, and finally the right to create wealth. Again, the invisible hand doesn't work quite as well as it did back in the 17 and 1800s, but it's still a factor in how we operate our economy. Again, his capitalism, talking Adam Smith again, based on some things here. Creation of wealth is the concern of individuals, not the government. Again, you have to own property to create the wealth. You can have economic freedom in all the markets, so the buyers and sellers enter and leave the market as they choose. The price of goods and services are strictly by demand and supply. And again, the role of government should be limited, and we have concerns about this the last quite a few years. But also, they should be providing our defense, make sure we have internal order, furnishing public works and education. And most people like to see the government not be so involved in business. Again, loosely translated again, hands off or let them do as they see fit. This is all based on the concept of a market economy. What is a market economy? A market economy is an economic system where the businesses and individuals decide what to produce and buy, just as Adam Smith talked about. And as I mentioned a while ago, the market is what determines the prices and the quantities of any item or service sold. What about the United States and capitalism? I mentioned earlier that most of you would probably consider our economy something of a capitalistic nature. It is to a degree, but we're termed nowadays a kind of a new word called a mixed economy. That means our economy has both elements of capitalism and socialism. I know that when you hear the word socialism, you might be concerned that we're talking about foreign government situations that are negative, but in this case, I'll give you an example of what we have in the United States that falls under socialism, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are social programs that actually take up quite a bit of the U.S. economy at this time, and they're considered socialism. So since that's what we have mixed with capitalism, we're simply called a mixed economy. Again, in the mixed economy, there's 4 questions again. How do you produce something? What is it? For whom? And who produces it? How's that decided? It's decided by households who purchase goods and services. Who else purchases all these goods and services? United States. Businesses are a big part of our economy. And yes, the government is part of our economy because most of our government, city, state, federal, and our military are big customers for different goods. Military, for instance, buys vehicles, boats, airplanes. Businesses buy everything they need to run their business, such as computers, buildings, vehicles, etc. They have a diagram on this next slide. It's called the circular flow in our mixed economy. This one here I recommend that you look at and study if you want to understand how the U.S. economic system works. But basically it shows in the center of the circle governments. What are they doing in the circle? They're taking in taxes from households and businesses. They're providing services for both of those. When they do that, you have product markets, resource markets, that government spending is into resource markets. Resource markets are then furnished to the governments. Same thing for product markets. But look at this slide and study that, and you'll see how the system works. 3 groups in a mixed economy. We're still talking about the United States economy. You've got 3 being households, businesses, and government. I just mentioned households consume goods and services. Sometimes they're the owners of the factors of productions. You have consumer products, goods and services that are going to be used by individuals for personal consumption. Businesses are somewhat similar, produce goods and services to exchange for revenue, which is money. Then they turn around and take these revenues. That's how they purchase the factors of production and keep the cycle moving. All the government really does, they take in taxes and provide services. We're going to look at a different kind of economy, one you may have heard some about, but there's a command economy. Again, unlike the United States, in this type of economy, they decide what goods and services we produced at government level, how they're going to be produced, who gets them, who owns and controls the factors of production. When you look at command economies, and you'll need to study these, they'll be a little bit confusing. You have 2 types of economic systems around the world that are good examples of command economies. One is socialism, one is communism. Let's first look at socialism. Again, as I mentioned a while ago, the government decides, number one, what is going to be produced, how it's produced, who owns and controls the factors of production. They own and control the key industries. In a socialism setup, workers can at times choose their own occupations. In a socialism setup, the goal of that type of government is to equally distribute income, eliminate poverty, provide social services, and finally eliminate economic waste. In these cases, in socialism, there are times when there are small-scale private businesses that may be permitted. Now let's look at communism. You'll need to know the difference in that and socialism. Again, in a communist setup, the government owns and controls all factors of productions. The government do all the plans to produce whatever, basically for the needs of the state. A little bit different, not just individuals, but the state. They dictate occupation, they dictate wages and prices. Different than socialism and capitalism, the goal is to create a classless society where all contribute according to their ability and receive benefits according to their needs. Remember that in communism, unlike socialism that allows some private business, in communism there are no private businesses allowed. I expect at this time you could come up with a good example of communism that's not appearing to work well nowadays. My best example would be North Korea, and many millions of people are starving, living in situations where prisons are what operate a lot of their manufacturing. If you're born in a prison setup, generations later, your children, grandchildren will be working in the same area. Now we're going to switch into something entirely different. We need some way to measure economic performance in any type of economy. The word productivity, the average level of output per worker per hour. This is something that is easier to compare with economies around the world, actually, if you can break down this, the average level of output per worker per hour. There's a thing we call gross domestic product. You probably hear this on television at times. It's called GDP. Remember that gross means the overall amount. So the total value of all goods and services produced by all people within the boundaries of a country during a 1 year period. So anytime you hear me or the television news talk about GDP, we're talking about the total value. That's goods, services, manufacturing by all people within the boundaries of an entire country for a year. When things go to a situation where prices are rising, the term for that is called inflation. The opposite of that is deflation, where you have a general decrease. Prices are beginning to fall. And again, we'll talk about why these things occur and sometimes what the government does to intervene to try to change what's going on there. The next slide is actually a chart. It covers the years 1990 to 2014. And what they're doing here is showing the change in GDP and real GDP for the United States. The thing is, if you look at the chart, it's got two different lines. One's green, one is blue. GDP is just what they're measuring. The blue line in what they call real GDP is the same number converted to what the value of a dollar is today compared to when this is going on. In other words, in 1990, the real GDP level is 9 if you look at the left side in trillions of dollars. The actual is 6. We'll talk more about that later. Some more things you hear about probably from news, magazines, maybe your parents. Consumer Price Index, which they shorten to CPI. Our government has people hired all over the United States. They go into major markets, not the small towns, and basically look at the price of bread, milk, gasoline, things that are a typical consumer purchase item in an urban area, not small towns again. So what they do this once a month. They make their list, they turn it in. At the end of the time frame for the next month, those numbers are tallied, and it'll come out as a CPI. And they'll either talk about it going up a tenth of a point or two tenths, or going down, depending on what prices are doing. Depends on inflation as well. The next thing is PPI, otherwise known as Producer Price Index. This has to do with manufacturing. This index is the measure of prices that producers are getting for their finished goods, such as automobiles, machinery, appliances. This is different from CPI. In CPI, there's no government subsidies, sales tax, distribution costs factored in. But Producer Price Index does have situations where there are government subsidies. An example of that would be what they put in gasoline, ethanol. The corn that is bought to make ethanol is hauled to a place that converts the corn into that ethanol. That is subsidized. The price of that corn is subsidized by the federal government. That ethanol is then transported, usually by truck, to the nearest place where they have a factory making gasoline. That transportation cost is subsidized. So totally different than CPI. There are sales and excise taxes involved, and obviously distribution costs. So PPI is totally different. Here are some measures on the next slide of economic health. And we'll talk about some of these in more depth. The balance of trade. Again, when you mention that, you're talking about the total value of a nation's exports minus the total value of its imports over a specific period of time. That period of time is usually best talked about on an annual basis. The Consumer Confidence Index. This is usually reported on a monthly basis. It's basically looking at consumers by doing surveys, and they find out if it's an optimistic time in the consumer market or is it a pessimistic time. Corporate profits, they again talk about on television and in magazine, is simply how much profit do the corporations make in a specific time period. These are usually measured on an annual basis. As I mentioned earlier, the thing called inflation rate. How much have goods and services increased in price over a certain period of time? This is calculated monthly, and then on an annual basis, they take the 12 months and give you an inflation rate for the year, but they usually go ahead and report it somewhere in magazines and periodicals from the government on a monthly basis. Of course, national income talks about total income earned by population, including employees. That includes self-employed ones. It also includes corporations and other types of income. What is the national income level? New housing starts are just what it says. How many new homes have been started under construction in a specific time period? During a time of growth in the economy, you would expect new housing starts to be increasing regularly. In a time where you're having inflation is getting really strong, it'll finally get to a point where they're not affordable. The interest rates are too high to make it where people can buy houses. Then the housing starts begin to fall. And again, we'll discuss that in more depth later. Something you do need to know is called the prime interest rate. That's the lowest interest rate that banks charge their most credit-worthy customers. When you go to get a loan for a business and you're new, never started one before, the bank's going to look at your credit report, the feasibility of your business. They're going to quote you a price that they'll charge you on a loan they would make you, and it's going to say prime plus 1, 2, 3, 4 points. So if the prime interest rates that they charge the top customers is 4%, and they say prime plus 2 for your new business, they'll be talking about 6%. Now we're going to get into something that's called the business cycle. It's very important to understand, a very important thing for all businesses to watch. For instance, you don't want to get into a business cycle and develop a new product when that type of product is being replaced on the market with new technology. So we have what they call the business cycle. You have growth and recession in our economy, particularly in the United States. So the cycle is what changes occur that result from either economic growth or economic downturn. Ends up being what is the amount of products and services that consumers are willing to purchase. Obviously, if the economy is moving along well, everything is growing, then the public purchases more, consumers do. And also the amount of products and services produced by business firms. Businesses will be watching the consumers, and they'll have to adjust their level of production based on purchases. The next slide has a really good slide, shows you a picture of what we call the 4 phases of the business cycle. Okay, when you first take off with a product, for instance, if you look at that chart on the bottom left, it's a new item. It's going to grow at pretty high rate usually in sales and revenue. It does finally reach a peak. For instance, let's use iPhones, mobile phones. As these phones are developed by different companies, somebody will come out with the new one. They're in the business cycle. Everybody's already got a phone on the market, but they put something new. They're going to enter up here toward the peak and try to get some of the market. Eventually, in the phases of business cycle, you have a recession. And again, that's something that occurs every so many years. It's not anything that can be predicted with any accuracy when the next recession will be. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 year cycle. Sometimes we're having cycles that are twice that. But of course, once you go into recession, you have deflation, prices dropping, sales dropping, revenue dropping, and then finally, depending on different things, sometimes some government intervention, the economy will begin to recover. Before it starts that, it reaches the bottom of the picture there, shows the word trough. So they call it a trough when the recession is in its process of ending and you're about to begin recovery. And of course, recovery, in our case nowadays, the last couple of years has been a very, very slow one. And I personally think that's a good thing. If you have a slow, gradual, but strong recovery, it's going to last longer before you have another recession. Now, who intervenes sometimes when you're down in the trough? What can you do about the business cycle? Can you make it change course? Most people believe yes. We have the thing called the Federal Reserve Bank. There's about 15 of these banks scattered around the United States. And of course, they loan money to businesses is one thing. But mainly they set the monetary policies that determine the supply of money across the whole nation. That affects the interest rates. If the Federal Reserve feels like the economy is really going poorly, generally they will drop the interest rates. In the last recent years, interest rates dropped to near zero to help turn the economy around. At the time we're talking here, the Fed is moving gently up on interest rates because what happens once you get out of the trough and you're into recovery, if you have too fast of a recovery, you're going to be looking at inflation being ready to slow you down again. So the Federal Reserve is going to be very slow to change interest rates during the recovery once they see it, that their policy has worked. Question becomes, there's still a lot of debate on this. Should the Federal Reserve have the power that it has? Secondly, is it wise to try to manipulate the business cycle? Again, there's different opinions on this. most economists believe, yes, they should have the power because history has shown the last 20, 30 years that when the Federal Reserve gets involved during a recession, that they're able to help turn it into a growth period sooner than waiting for it to happen on its own. Now we're going to look at debt. There's something talked about a lot nowadays called the federal deficit. Unfortunately, this is something that's grown and grown and grown. But what it is, deficit means shortfall. So the federal deficit is a shortfall created when the federal government spends more in a fiscal year than it receives. Back in 2014, the United States budget was upside down to the tune of $483 billion. The following year, it was worse, $468 billion deficit. Different than the federal deficit, the terminology national debt. And this debt is what's been accumulating over years and years of federal deficits. You keep having to add these up, your losses in previous years. You end up with a number called the national debt. Unfortunately, that debt has grown exponentially the last 10, 15 years. But the national debt definition is just what it says, the total amount the federal government owes at a given time. It's nearly unbelievable, but the national debt in 2014 was almost 18 trillion. And by 2015, just a year later, it was over 18 trillion. I expect at this time we're probably over 19 trillion. We're going to change gears entirely and talk about what is competition. Competition in the business world is just the rivalry among businesses for sales to potential customers. Again, in a capitalistic economy, society, only businesses that provide consumers with useful products and services at a fair price will survive. If you're providing a service or a business that you think's real good, but you can't get it placed in the market properly where people will pay the money for it, then your business will not survive. So that's the capitalistic side of the American economy. The book talks about 4 kinds of competition, or 4 degrees. You have perfect competition, monopolistic, a couple of words you're not too familiar with, oligopoly, and then monopoly. You'll need to know the difference in these when I give you an exam. The next slide has a real good short number of how many people are in the market in the United States, the different types of competition, and gives some good examples. In perfect competition, it would make sense. There's many number of suppliers or businesses. Example of that is the production of corn, wheat, peanuts, and a lot of other agricultural products. Monopolistic, there's still, surprisingly, the word mono doesn't sound like it, but monopolistic competition still has many suppliers. Clothing and shoes are good examples. Then we move up a notch to what's called an oligopoly. There's not very many in this type of competition, very few as a matter of fact. Perfect example, automobiles. There's only a few automobile companies in the United States at this time. We have what they call the big 3, then some of the overseas companies have assembly plants in the United States. So the best example of an oligopoly is automobiles in my mind. Then you get to monopoly. Just like the game, it means exactly what it says. One producer of that. They give an example of software that's protected by a copyright. My favorite example of monopoly is a utility. Like in Kerrville, El Paso, anywhere, there's usually only one supply for electricity or natural gas or water. The one reason is it's such a high cost to get in the business. It's also very regulated by the government. So just remember the word. Monopoly in competition means there's only one player in the game. Let's go back to perfect competition. Okay, some conditions of that. You've got a single product. There's no way anybody can be told they can't produce it. It's wide open. Any firm that wants to enter the industry can. Everybody's selling about the same product. They're assuming here buyers and sellers know everything there is to know about the market. Also, the overall market is not affected by the actions of any one buyer or seller. Okay, we talked earlier about supply and demand. This tells you a little more about it. In perfect competition, the price of everything that is offered is set by what we call supply and demand. Of course, the supply is simply the number of any product that anyone is willing to produce and consumers are willing to buy. Demand is the consumer side. The demand is what is it, the quantity that buyers are willing to purchase at the different various prices. So where the lines on a diagram here on the next slide cross, that's going to be your market price. If you look at this slide, you look at the blue line, that's the manufacturer making, say, automobiles. As that price goes up, the demand curve is falling down if you look at the green curve. In this case, where they cross, the market price would be $8, right in the center of the diagram. And that's going to be at the quantity of 2 million bushels of wheat, say. We're going to change to monopolistic competition. Again, in this case, different than monopoly. It's monopolistic competition. Again, we said a while ago there's many buyers and a large number of sellers. Things that they sell are very similar, and they're going to satisfy about the same need. Sellers try to get an edge here by differentiation. For instance, on a laptop computer, a unique feature might be that this one company will put a larger battery, a better memory setup. You can do things like change your brand name to something very attention-getting. You can even package it differently. You can offer special services. These are all things you're going to be trying to do because this is a real competitive market to be in when it's monopolistic competition. Going back to the automobiles, my best example of an oligopoly. Again, there are a few and there are large sellers involved. I mentioned earlier also the barriers to entry in this market is why there's oligopolies. It's very, very expensive to build a car factory. That's only after you've designed it, research and development, raise the money. So it's considerable investment, money and time. In this market, the actions of each seller have a big effect on the competitors' sales and prices. Again, I think speaking of automobiles is a good example. If you'll notice when a company offers a car, they're going to give $1,000 cash back after just a short amount of time. Most of the other major automobile companies will be giving cash back. Next thing you know, somebody's offering free oil changes and car washes for life on the car. You turn around a few days later, the competition's having to offer the same thing. Okay, conditions of a monopoly. This gets down to, again, where there's one seller and there's not a substitute that's very close for whatever product or service we're talking about here. Again, large barriers to keep others from entering the market. Usually, again, that refers to large capital outlay. Sometimes there's patents involved. Sometimes there's government regulation and licensing involved that keep most people from getting in the market. In this case, the seller sets its price based strictly on demand. There's some different kinds of monopolies. I mentioned utilities earlier. Utilities operate in a natural monopoly where that large investment would be very wasteful. It'd be silly to put another electric company producing electricity in most cities. They've already got all the power lines, all the capital set up that they need to produce electricity. It's not going to make sense to duplicate that. So that means the public interest is best served by leaving that natural monopoly alone. Again, there's always state and federal and sometimes local scrutiny involved with things like utilities. So again, that's a large barrier. Then you have a limited monopoly. That's when whatever you're wanting to do has to have a franchise, a license, a copyright or such, or even a trademark. So at this point, strictly the government's involved, and if someone else is already in that monopoly, then it's going to be very hard for you to enter the market. Now we're going to change to the economy, particularly in the United States, as it began. In the beginning of our economy in the United States, we had what they call the barter system. There's a little bit of that going on nowadays, but it's quite infinitesimal compared to the large economy. But you're simply trading goods for either other goods or something you wanted. You're not using money in the exchange. So barter is simply changing a good or service for something you need, whether it be a good or service. An example, back in the early days, maybe you're good at raising apples. You get these apples in a basket, you go down the road, someone else is raising corn. And that's exactly how the economy worked. You would trade one item for the other. The domestic system was what occurred where you had manufacturing in homes mostly. Families would process them and offer them to sell by the merchant entrepreneur. So the domestic system, before we had big factories, you had homes and farms producing things that would be sold to stores or merchants that went around and delivered them back in the day. Finally, what developed was what we call the factory system, and that's where you put in place all the machinery, people, buildings, everything you need to produce something. It's all assembled in one place, and that's where we are today on manufacturing. Productivity, it talks about on this slide, from 1820 to 1900 was the golden age of invention, and particularly with regard to innovation in machinery. Also, that's when railroads and all these kinds of things expanded the domestic markets for American products. Specialization, though, is something you do to improve productivity. What you're doing there, you're going particularly into a factory. Henry Ford is the one that really capitalized on this idea, where he had people all in the buildings doing one thing to put together a Model T car. It was a specialization such as installing the engine, putting the top on the car, putting the wheels and tires on the car. That's what happened, and that's how we came up with the assembly line. In the early 1900s, again, we had rapid growth of all industries in the United States. What you hear some about is the stock market crash, which occurred in 1929. They called that the Roaring Twenties. Things were just growing like crazy. And again, things got overpriced. The stock market was way, way above the real world. And when things began to fall, it ended up closing many, many banks, businesses, and there were a very high percent of unemployment in the ensuing 10 years. So after the crash, they called that the Great Depression. We talked about government intervention nowadays with the Federal Reserve to get the economy moving. In the early 30s, it was obvious that the government had to do something. federal government came up with several programs for recovery all over the United States. They built buildings, libraries, parks, all kinds of things infrastructure-wise across the United States, employed by the federal government. A lot of people had to get on a train, drive their car, and go to a project that federal government was running in order to make a living and basically either bring their family with them or send the money home. So at this time is the most time where government got really heavily involved in all businesses, particularly in the United States. Again, what happened after that? What really turned around the economy was an unfortunate incident. The economy was beginning to turn around in 1939, 1940, but then we had the thing happen called World War II, and of course the United States got involved in it. You had rapid economic growth then because agencies such as General Motors, Ford, different ones that had factories ended up making products for the U.S. government, for the military, making airplanes, jeeps, all sorts of things to run the war for the United States. Once the war was over, we had economic growth, and everybody was coming home from the war during the 50s. We had everybody seeking a higher standard of living, including education. They came out with what they called the GI Bill for college. A lot of the returning soldiers went back to college and got their degrees and walked into jobs. They began to build developments across the United States again and producing more and more automobiles, appliances, etc. What happened in the 60s, you had what they called a social responsibility movement. Again, there's many things and programs that we'll talk about some in this course that occurred during the 60s. One thing that most people remember about the 70s, you had a shortage of crude oil happen all of a sudden, caused everything to go up in price because the price of oil affects so many things in our economy. During that shortage, we had shutdown of oil coming into the United States. They were withholding sales from overseas. We had lines several blocks long to buy gasoline for your car. It was a very serious problem. You may have seen some video from back in those days. The last part of the 70s is when the really highest inflation in recent times occurred. When you had that high inflation, of course, businesses suffered, and the business profits were very poor. And all the way through the early 1980s, many businesses failed, and you can look at the level of bankruptcies later in this course, what went on then. The level of bankruptcies increased greatly, as it does in even recessions. Then, when the economy turned around, partly due to the Federal Reserve getting involved again with interest rates, we had sustained economic growth all through the 1990s. In fact, it got a little bit out of hand, and we'll talk about that. Again, 2000 and beyond, where are we now? Obviously, technology is increasing and getting more and more affordable. The growth of the service economy has continued to occur. It's over 80% of all business in the United States at this point in time. But a service economy is where you have more effort devoted to production of services than of goods. So if you ask a question, what is the economy like today in the United States, your correct answer would be, we have a situation where it's a service economy. Some negative things about what are going on. We still have some economic indicators showing some economic problems and pessimism among consumers. Something that's not new but rises and falls depending on things that are going on is social unrest. You have political uncertainty. mostly on the national level, but somewhat on the state and local levels. The political uncertainty on the national level depends on which particular party is in control of our government, has the majority voting rights, and one time it'll be more and more regulations. The next thing you know, the different party, they'll erase those things, regulations, sometimes to too large of a degree there, and we don't have quite enough regulation. So that government intervention swings both ways, and very often it goes too far in either direction. What's the current business environment right now? Again, we've talked about it, but the main thing about capitalism is the word competition. What's changed is we now have what we call a global environment. It's not just competition American businesses have with each other, but we have competition from all over the globe. For instance, no surprise, many of the things that you purchase today, particularly manufactured goods, if you'll look somewhere on that item, a high percent of them have the word produced in China on them. 2 decades ago or so, 3, it would have the word Japan on them. And prior to that, we weren't importing a whole lot from around the world. But at this point in time, if you're in any kind of major business in the United States, you're actually competing with businesses from all over the globe. Again, technology changes rapidly also in the building of manufacturing equipment, how you distribute products, and communication. Manufacturing equipment, if you don't know, when they build automobiles, they replace many people on the assembly line with robots. Robots put together a high percent of automobiles and trucks today. In order to do that, they're relying on the high-tech continuing changes in that type of equipment. Even how the distribution of products are taken care of, getting it out to the consumer. At this point in time, it's mostly done by trucks and trains, but it's increasingly a lot of things are carried by air. There's other ideas on the horizon where, for instance, trucks will be total electric and run by computer and not people driving them. So there's lots of changes in technology, even with the distribution of products. Anytime you make a business decision, and very soon you'll be put onto a project in this course called Project T. But when you develop a new business, or if you're going to purchase a new business, any business decision you make, you need to look at what is the economic environment. First of all, in the particular place you're going to put your business. Secondly, on a larger scale, what is the economy doing at this point in time? What are consumers doing? Are they tightening their spending? Are they out there in the market more? You've got to look at the total economic environment before you make any major business decision. Now we're going to get off into something that's considered green. What that is there's economic pressures today for sure, but there's a lot more going on in the last 10, 20 years about being socially responsible in business. And that's mostly to do with production and manufacturing. Again, the word sustainability comes in. That means can I maintain the conditions where humans and nature can exist together in harmony? You can still fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations. Okay, there's different things there you can do. The picture usually tells a lot, but the picture shows the sustainability growing. It shows plants. Challenges going forward. When the economy is doing well, it provides jobs for most people that are willing to work. Still today, the reason people are pouring into the United States, The United States offers a standard of living that few countries can match. In the United States, again, there's lots of opportunity for advancement. People that are willing to work hard, go to school, get educated, etc. Again, different than most countries in the world. I've already talked about one time when it did not work well. The Great Depression of the 1930s. Again, economic problems of the 70s and early 80s, where we're in a long-term deep recession. Prices were low, jobs were scarce. Then we had what we now call the crash of 2008, which is the most recent economic crisis. There's a debate on what caused that, but again, it's usually something that's overrated or inflated. One of the main causes of this last one, most economists believe, had to do with the finance of the housing market and all the different derivatives that they put together to sell to investors involving high-risk loans, moderate-risk loans, and worse, very poor-risk loans on homes of all types. So they put together things and tools, sold them, and when things went bad in the economy a little bit, one of the wage earners of the home would lose their job and the home would be lost. And this type of thing continued until we had a really deep recession going on. Again, some more challenges that we have looking forward. Need to answer some of these questions. How do we get a more stable economy? How do we create jobs, new jobs for the unemployed? Because these jobs are changing with technology is replacing a lot of human jobs, but on the same side of that, there's more and more jobs in the service economy. The companies that are growing the fastest are people that are not actually in the manufacturing business. So there's jobs there and in the service industry. Next, how do we reduce the national debt and still stimulate business growth? This is the big conundrum right now. That question has not been answered well by any party lately, because we stimulate business and it grows, but unfortunately we've seen the national debt continue to grow at the same time. Years and years ago, several decades, we had the opposite effect. When national debt was going down, you could tell that we had a strong economy and we were paying the debt down. The deficit was shrinking. There were certain times, even 20 years ago, where there was not an annual deficit. We didn't add to the national debt. Another question, how do you restore investor confidence in the financial and banking system? And I think that's, again, being answered as we speak. Investors are now back since the last couple of years where they can go to a bank and borrow money to start a business or borrow money to buy a home. So when this is going on, there's funds available. There are investors in the market willing to invest. That's when the individual confidence rises. Another question, how do you use technology to make American workers more productive? A good example of that is what's occurred even in farming. Over the last 20, 30 years, they've developed tractors and related machinery where one person can handle 10 times the acreage of a farm that they were able to before. The big question, how do we keep American firms more and more competitive in the global marketplace? Again, I hope that your generation has some better answers to most of these questions. I think you particularly will with regard to national debt and dealing with the economy and dealing with sustainability. Some more questions again get into how do we have the benefit of competition in small business continue? How about conserving natural resources and again sustain our environment? Most modern management theory now is looking at the idea that we need to add another dimension to developing in a business or turning a business around. That would be not that profit's not important, but that you need to look at what is this manufacturer doing to help sustain the environment, and also not just sustain it, but maybe even improve it, the national environment. So that is a new thing that we need to look at when you see successful business. Number one, they're hiring people, providing jobs, providing good products, providing income benefits all the stakeholders. But finally, how are we doing on sustaining our environment? It's an important thing to look at for all new business. Another thing we need to work on continuously, how do we resolve social unrest? You've got still inequality in our society in America. It's been there forever. I do personally think there's been lots of improvement, but yes, we've got a long ways to go. So the question is, what can we come up with that will help these situations? How do we meet the needs of two-income families? Also, single parents. There's still about a 50% divorce rate in the United States. So that means there's many, many, many single parents, most of which are female. So how do you meet the needs? For instance, child care. A lot of big companies are now offering benefits that include child care at the work site. And by the way, while they're at the work site, they've got exercise machinery in rooms. A lot of them have cafeterias available. But how about older Americans? The number of older Americans, again, percentage of our population is growing because in America particularly, the lifespan has been increasing and increasing. How about the unfortunate who need health care and social programs to exist? For instance, mental health. Mental health is probably the most overlooked segment of our population needs. What can each state and each part of our federal government do to improve the health care and programs for the mentally ill and less fortunate is the question. Finally, what about terrorism? How can we combat it? How do we resolve conflict in these countries that are appearing to furnish most of that terrorism? What do we do about North Korea? There's many other countries. I know we're not going to have the answers in this class, but I want you to begin thinking about all these questions that this chapter talks about, because you're going to be the generation who answers these questions and solve the problems talked about. Okay, that's the end of the slides for this chapter. I hope you'll use this as a tool to review the chapter before you have the exam.